Just closing the eyes. And just breathing in and breathing out. And as you breathe in and breathe out, be very aware of the power of your breath. That the inhale is drawing in life, and the exhale is offering that life. That the inhale is bringing in energy, and the exhale is expressing that energy. The inhale is receiving, and the exhale is generously giving. When asked about the path to consciousness, Shiva replied, "There are 9 ways concerning breath. The first, this experience may dawn between 2 breaths. After the breath comes in and moves down, and just before turning up and out, the expression and experience of beneficence." So as you are breathing in and breathing out, allow yourself, give yourself permission to experience that beneficence, the benevolence, the balance. In that moment of experience is the ultimate consciousness. Taking another moment to move closer to that. To surrender a little more deeply. And then drawing the hands together in front of the heart. We'll lift our voices in one beautiful Om in celebration of that. Take a nice breath in. Om. Bowing the head to the heart, acknowledging all that is. And draw the face to center and release the hands and flutter the eyes open. Good morning. So today's talk is on Shiva and Shakti. And Shiva and Shakti, simply stated, are the masculine and feminine essence of the universe. But what on earth does that mean? Simply stated, they represent the opposites that exist in the manifest universe, the materialized universe. But what does that mean? They represent everything in all ways. So Shiva is the essence of stability, strength, logic. Shakti is the essence of mobility, fluidity, and creativity. And together, they hold a promise. The promise that they hold is experience. That in this life, no matter whether we are practicing stability or fluidity, no matter whether we are in our logical mind or our creative mind, we're guaranteed to have an experience. We may be open to it or closed to it, but the experience will be there. But there are different levels of experience. There are experiences that bring suffering. There are experiences that bring healing. And there are experiences that are considered to be highly conscious laden. Those would be the experiences of God, of the divine, of your true self. The Shakti is defined in scriptures as power. It's not a woman, and it's not a man. It is power. And I'd like to read to you a verse from the Mahakala Samhita. In defining Shakti, it says, "Thou art neither girl, nor maid, nor old. Indeed, thou art neither female, nor male, nor neuter. Thou art inconceivable, immeasurable power, the being of all which exists, void of all duality, the supreme Brahman, attainable in illumination alone." So what this hymn from the Mahakala is telling us is that we can talk about Shakti. We can say Shakti is feminine power, Shakti is creativity, Shakti is fluidity, Shakti is power, absolutely. But unless we enter into a state of ultimate consciousness, we cannot really know what that means. We will only ever have an incomplete experience of that until we allow ourselves to come into a state of high consciousness. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments, what that actually entails. But it is similar when we talk about Shiva, that there is this ultimate grounding, this ultimate stability, this logic. The logic is not problem-solving logic. It's not saying 2 + 2 = 4. It's not saying, well, obviously one is right and the other one is wrong. It's not that kind of logic. It's the logic of nature. It's the logic of the nautilus. It's the logic of the tree of life. It's the logic of the constellations. It's the logic of the flow of the universe. That is Shiva. That's the level of logic. And again, we can talk about that and try to define it in our conversations, but we will only ever have an incomplete experience of that unless and until we enter into a state of high consciousness, a high surrender. And then we will be able to experience that from within rather than without. So there is this Shakti and this Shiva. And we work really hard to try and understand that in our spirituality and in our life, if in fact that's even part of our path. And sometimes we get caught up in ideas about what they represent, that Shakti is feminine. The word Shakti grammatically is feminine because it ends with an I. But that does not mean that Shakti is only the female form. It's actually not. Grammatically, it is associated with the feminine. And Shiva, which ends with an A, which grammatically is masculine, is therefore associated with the masculine. And because as people, we like opposites because we like to categorize and compare, we look at that and we say, well, they're two halves of the whole. The Shiva and the Shakti are two halves of what brings wholeness. They're opposites of each other in our minds. But once we enter into a state of higher consciousness, we begin to understand that those opposites are actually not so opposite after all. They're inherent parts of one another that cannot be separated out. So the Shiva and the Shakti are oftentimes depicted as something called Ardha Narishwara, which is the half male, half female deity. And that essence is symbolic of the perfect harmonization of energy. The allowance of the masculine energy, the allowance of the feminine energy to come through a state of exquisite logic that includes the dance of creativity, the dance of manifestation and diversity. In the Tantra scriptures, which in the Shakta tradition, and the Shakta tradition is the tradition that sees the Shakti as the absolute form, generally speaking, or formless, I should say, to be more correct, that the basis of all the universe is this Shakti, this movement, this essence. In the Shakta tradition, the Tantras that are associated with the Shakti, and generally with Shiva, are conversations between them, which I think is kind of cool, actually. Like, we get to be listening in on a divine conversation as they talk to each other and as they question each other and as they discover the essence of each other. Because we can only come to know ourselves through our experience, and the only way we can come to know each other is through communication with each other. And so they illustrate this for us. Because Shakti says to Shiva in one of the Tantras, she says, tell me a little bit about you. Tell me what you are, who you are, what you represent, what you long for. And he goes on to define himself for her. And then in the Devi Mahatmya, it's the opposite. Shiva says, tell me about yourself. Who are you? What are you? Tell me what your heart longs for. And she replies to him. And in some ways, we could look at these types of writings, these types of scriptures, as indicating a necessity for communication, indicating a necessity for humility, to not just simply think we know it all, and that we can look at a person and be an ultimate judge of who they are. Because for all of these scriptures, there is an esoteric application and there's a practical application. And the esoteric application in many ways is far beyond the conversation that we're going to have today. But the practical application is not. It's right here, right now. It's saying that through modes of communication and curiosity is how we come into a deeper knowing of each other. And also how we come into a deeper knowing of what is Shiva and what is Shakti and what is the harmony that they bring together into our lives and into our experience. So stepping back for a moment and saying, experience is key. Not necessarily book understanding, but experience is key. And in the Tantras, there's an exquisite quote, and I will read that for you. And I typically don't go off of paper too much, but these are so beautiful that I do not wish to paraphrase them. From the Mahakala Rudra scripture, Shiva himself to Mahakali says, I torture not my body with penances. Here he's saying this body is hers. So why on earth would I torture it? Why would I starve it? Why would I commit austerities to it? If in fact we exist in a state of unity, which in Tantra is considered non-duality, if in fact you adhere to the idea that there's a little bit of God inside of you, why would you treat your body badly? Why would you treat your mind badly? Why would you treat your emotional self poorly, causing yourself suffering? Would you not want to treat this as a temple and commit to realizing the inherent goodness that exists within it, instead of the judgment of what we think is bad or poor or unfortunate? He goes on to say, I lame not my feet in pilgrimage to holy places, because if in fact we adhere to the idea that there's a little bit of God in each of us, then you are the holy place. So you don't need to go anywhere. So many times we go on pilgrimage to India or to Israel or to Africa or to this place or to that place. We go seeking that which is holy, But the reality is that according to these teachings, you are the holy place. And you don't need to go any further. What you need to do is go inside in order to recognize and realize and remember that holiness. To seek the holiness outside of yourself causes each one of us to say, well, I guess then that the sacred exists over there, so maybe not so much over there. It causes us to look and to bypass the sacredness of all of creation instead of sitting within creation as part of the creation with a little bit of the Creator inside and recognizing that universal oneness, that consciousness, that flow. He goes on to say, I spend not my time in reading the Vedas. The Vedas are a primary scripture in India. And in this statement, there's an implication that once you understand the unity, once you understand the divinity, once you understand the sacredness, once you have surrendered yourself to it, once you have opened the heart to Shiva and Shakti, as Hanuman opened his heart to Rama, as the gopis opened their heart to Krishna, then you don't need the book anymore. Until then you do. Until you surrender yourself wholly and fully, you do need the book, because we need the guideline. We need the study of how to behave like a person filled with goodness, because we forget, But once we remember, then the book is not necessary. Why? Because surrender is in place. Surrender to the goodness. Surrender to the experience. And we come to understand that the sacred is everywhere. And that what we call our mistakes or our wrongdoings are actually part of the path that we're walking. And they serve a purpose for us. Our mistakes don't make us bad people. Our mistakes give us opportunities to learn and grow and to remember. Our misfortunes are not ill will, unless they are. Unless that's what we look at them as. And then all they will do is cause us more suffering. And maybe that's part of the path too. Because there are people who say, whatever happens, no matter what it is, no matter whether you are laughing or crying, screaming or whispering, loving or hating, experiencing oneness or vast separation, it is your path, because that's where the learning is. Oftentimes, we seek out opportunities to learn. We say, well, I want to go over here and have this person tell me something. I want to go over here and have this person tell me something. I want to go over here and have this person tell me something. And typically the something that we want them to tell us is what's wrong with us, where we're going wrong. And there's only one place where we're mistaken on our path, and that's when we're not actively, openly, consciously walking it, and instead we're denying it. And Shiva and Shakti, they hold the promise of experience. Not good experience versus bad experience, just experience. And so in order to embrace the concept of the Shakta, or the Shaivism, which is the devotion to Shiva, or the schools that have both together, which basically they all do, is to accept the experience as the path. Understanding that there are many levels of experience, but all experience is the manifestation of both the Shiva and the Shakti. So there is nothing that can happen in your life that doesn't have the potential to bring you closer to yourself and thereby closer to them, or to that, if you prefer the formless, or to Krishna, or to Christ, or to Muhammad, or whatever avatar name you choose. Embracing your life, embracing your experiences as the opportunities to learn that they are, as the opportunities to grow, as the opportunity to become humble, to bow down, to realize that there is so much more to this than the corner that we've backed ourselves into. Opens us up to a greater knowing. So one level of knowing is incomplete. And that is the level where we think we're separate. Where we think that what happens to me must be different and less or more than what happens to you. And this idea that I have to go outside of myself and go from temple to temple to temple, or from holy place to holy place to holy place, in order to find myself and in order to find my connection to the divinity. That's an incomplete understanding, according to yoga. According to the tantric perspective in yoga, that's an incomplete understanding. But it's still your path if that's what you're walking. The complete understanding they define as having the experience of yourself from within yourself and from within the essence of that. So seeing yourself as within that creation and as part of that creator. From within Shiva and Shakti and the marriage that exists in your life to their essence and their essence to your life. From your heart to their essence and from their essence to your heart. From within that, not from outside of it. And then when you go on pilgrimage, when you do decide to go to the temple and go to the sacred space and go, it's different somehow because you're not searching outside of yourself. Instead, you're just recognizing that the temples are sacred, the trees are sacred, the grass is sacred, the flowers are sacred, the people are sacred, the sky is sacred, the 5 elements are sacred, everything is sacred. And so everywhere you go, and instead of going longing to find what you forgot, you go because it is simply another aspect of what you've remembered. Does that make sense? Yeah? I guess it comes down on some level to a question of how much of your life do you see as sacred? How much of your life do you see if you study Shiva and Shakti, or if you have been introduced to those concepts, how much of your life do you see as being an inherent part of that back and forth, that play, that dance that they undergo? How much of your life do you see as separate? Are you an onlooker or are you a participant? If you're an onlooker, then we can take one step back and say, the person who thinks they are simply looking into a life from outside is susceptible to being a non-participant and thinking that life happens to them. Whereas the individual who sees themselves as a participant in this flow of sacredness, in the flow of the world, as a participant in that, then they're empowered to walk through life, having an experience, and being able to choose how they're going to respond or react to things, rather than feeling like everything simply happens to them. Does that make sense? A little bit? Yeah? So the essence of Shiva and Shakti, in the light of this conversation, which really truly is a much longer and larger conversation, and it's sometimes challenging to take these concepts that are so vast and to put them into 45 minutes of talking, because there's so much that can be said, you know. Shakti is not just dancing. That's part of it, sure. To experience oneself in the midst of an actual dance, to get onto that floor right over there and to start spinning around and to feel the energetics. Certainly that is part, but that's not really it. Because anybody can go into the center of that floor over there and start spinning around and have it mean nothing to them. The question is, what does it mean to you? How do you embody, embrace? How do you reflect and relate that to your connection to knowing your higher self? To walking through this world with awareness, with presence, recognizing the potential that exists and that everything is a dance. But to the individual who is not accustomed to the idea of everything being sacred and everything being part of this cosmic dance, they might look at that and become overwhelmed or confused and say, well, I don't get it. I don't get how, there's violence in the world. How can that be part of a cosmic sacred dance? There are days when I feel like crap. I feel depressed. I feel this. I feel that. How can that be part of a sacred dance? To an individual who has not been introduced to the concepts of Shiva and Shakti, they haven't potentially yet explored the relationship between the logic and the creativity, between the stability and the flow, between the groundedness and the fluidity. And so the space can't necessarily be held for a larger inclusiveness. We get stuck, every single one of us, in this idea that it's somehow someone else's fault, rather than my own choice of walking with awareness and presence through this life. So to me, and I can really only ever speak to my own experience of this, to me, everything that I have studied, everything that I have read, everything that I have experienced, everything that I have learned about Shiva and Shakti, about Krishna, about any of the names, is that it is largely about my ability to allow myself to experience life in a more full, complete way, in a more empowered way, in a way that allows me to come into a greater sense of self-acceptance and therefore acceptance of others. And in that acceptance of myself and a greater acceptance of others, then I get to walk through this world in a less harmful way. And by walking through this world in a way that is less harmful, then I'm igniting less suffering upon others, hopefully. And in this experience that I have had of yoga, ahimsa is a foundational principle, and ahimsa means to be nonviolent, to be non-harming. So everything that I see in Shiva and Shakti, everything that I see in Krishna, everything that I see in Vishnu, Brahma, Saraswati, Lakshmi, Christ, Buddha, Allah, Muhammad, no matter what essence or name you're talking about, the first thing that I see there is non-harming, is the invitation to walk through this life with a deeper sense of presence, a greater overall sense of enjoyment. Not egotistical satisfaction, unless, of course, that's what it is, which is not bad or good, it's just what it is. But with a greater presence and enjoyment of the moment, because I'm working to accept a greater level of responsibility, a greater level of acknowledgement, a greater inclusivity. Always working to move closer and closer to a more complete experience of self, of other, of that, no matter the form we're talking about. So then the question becomes, how do I walk this path? How do each of us walk this path in order to experience that completeness more completely? With your eyes open, and with your heart open, and with an acknowledgement and an understanding that it's not a smooth path. Sometimes we think spirituality is kind of like a sexy word. It's all sparkles and unicorns and fairy wings. And it's all good intention. But the reality is that it's actually not. it's hard, and it's work, and it's day in and day out, paying attention on purpose. And sometimes when you say to yourself, I just want to stick my head back into the sand and not be bothered with any of this, to call yourself on that and to say, however, if what I'm truly seeking is a more profound, deep experience of what is sacred, then I can't put my head in the sand. I have to walk forward as that, acknowledging that this is all part of that. And in some interesting way, even sticking your head in the sand is part of that. You know? There's no getting away from that. It's inherently with us. And if we know it's inherently with us, then why are we avoiding it so immensely, instead of just embracing it and saying, I'm going to walk my path the best way that I can walk my path. If I make mistakes along the way, then they're part of my path. I'll learn from them. I'll grow from them. I'll have my eyes open to them. Perhaps part of me will be open to learning how to do it differently. I'll take the time to read the uplifting writings, whether they're scriptures or, modern spirituality, self-help books, Wayne Dyer, I'll take the time to read, to contemplate, but then I will take the time to experience, to have the embodied experience of the sacred, to acknowledge that that's what this life is for, and to give myself the opportunity to come into that more fully. What's the greatest thing that can happen? By more fully embracing our spirituality, the essence of Shiva and Shakti, the essence of whatever name it is that you put to that divinity, what is the greatest thing that can happen? Is that you heal as a person. On some level, you heal. On some level, we awaken. And in that awakening, we become a more cohesive community, a more cohesive family, not only a human family, although that would be first, and that would also be very nice, but a global, universal oneness, and all the potential that carries. What's the worst thing that could happen? The worst thing that could happen is that you forget again in certain moments that the potential exists within you and that the awakening is there for you. But in that forgetting, there's only going to be another remembering. In the moments that we forget or deny, it's just going to be followed by another moment where perhaps you'll be more open to remembering. It's kind of like being in a posture, and you first go into the posture, and the teacher is like, well, we're going to do pigeon pose. And there's that initial, maybe this is not your favorite posture. So you kind of shut down to it a little bit, and the body becomes a little tense. The body becomes a little tense and a little resistant. But then you get there, and in the next moment, you start to open up to it. You start to breathe into it. And then you start to remember, it's not exactly what I thought it was. It's not exactly what I anticipated it to be. And you begin to have the experience on yet another level. And then something else happens and you become resistant again. And then you open up again. And that's part of the dance of the Shakti and the Shiva, is there's this flow back and forth, resistance, allowance, resistance, allowance, resistance, allowance. With a disciplined spiritual practice, resistance potentially becomes less and less and less, and allowance becomes more and more and more, and presence becomes more and more and more. And the span of time that we exist in resistance is possibly less. And the awareness that we walk through life is potentially more. And then we are no longer someone that life happens to, at least not on the level perhaps that it once was. Instead, we become empowered to walk through life as full participants. Sometimes I get a little concerned about wording because it's really challenging to say we will become a full participant in life knowingly, because that's probably not exactly what's going to happen. We'll still have moments of forgetting. Nothing is 100% until, of course, it is. We should never allow ourselves to think that we'll be 100% awakened all the time. Because even the Buddha said, anybody can go to the top of the mountain, but nobody can stay there. As long as there is one being in this world that is still suffering, every single one of us must come back, resolving the karma of suffering until there is no suffering. So we can awaken in any moment to compassion, we can awaken to goodness, we can awaken to the creativity and the cosmic logic. We can awaken to that, we can know it intimately, what they call sensual knowing. But the odds of us staying in that knowing are not great. We will come back into the world, look at something, judge it, misplace the knowing for a little while until the opportunity comes to remember again. And so since that remembrance and forgetting is part of the dance, we may as well know that and stop judging ourselves because of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. We spend a lot of time judging ourselves. We spend a lot of time saying, why can't I be different? Don't ask yourself, why can't I be different? Just be different. Just be different, Just try it on for size. Don't be afraid. Fear is what keeps us from intimately engaging in that cosmic logic and that divine creativity. Fear is what keeps us from engaging in that. So in the yoga tradition, in the Shakta yoga tradition, courage, non-fearing, being fearless, is one of the primary qualities that the yogi or the yogini go after, to become fearless in our experience of spirituality, while in that fearlessness acknowledging that some part of this experience is incomplete because I'm coming at it from inside looking out, but the potential exists there for the experience to become complete when I recognize that what is out there is also in here. It's the same thing. That the microcosm and the macrocosm are actually the same. And then I don't need to look at the world in a dualistic perspective. Me versus thee. Or that and me. Or you and I. Instead, it's one. And in that, and this will, a few more moments and then I'll open it up to questions or conversation. That recognition of oneness allows us to hold a greater space for each other, a greater space in which you can dance and I can dance, and you can be logical and I can be logical, and you can have your realizations in your particular way, and I can have my realizations in my particular way. And they don't have to be opposed to one another. Thinking that we are opposed to one another commits the greatest harm to each other. And we see this in the Western world all the time now because the West is so engulfed in competition. You and me versus each other, not you and I together. Recognizing that some people see more clearly with glasses. Some people see more clearly without. Some people prefer roses. Some people like daisies. Some people drive Subarus, some people drive Hondas. Some people say Jesus Christ, some people say Allah. The essence of the experience of all these things is personal to who you are in this life, walking through this life, having the experience of this life. And what suits me doesn't necessarily suit you. This is what's wrong with dieting today in the West. It's like everybody goes on a diet fad. Somebody publishes a book, and it's got some really great points in it. And the person who wrote the book had great success with that book because that diet was meant for him or her. It wasn't meant for everybody who reads the book. And that's why it doesn't work for everybody who reads the book. And then people get all angry and say, oh, it must just be fake. It's not fake. It's personal. It depends on you and what you need in this life to face, address, and resolve karmas. To open up to knowing you are having an incomplete experience and then allowing yourself to move more intentionally toward a more complete experience. It's about you. And then somewhere on that path, somewhere along the line, we are able to heal on a level that allows us to open up to the inclusion of others by holding space for them and no longer harming them because of perceived differences that are actually incorrect and limiting. Violence doesn't come about because of spirituality or who you believe in or who you have faith in. Violence comes about because I either like what you say or I don't. That's why there's violence. Not because we see things differently. That you call something one name and I call it the other. It's because of the ego attachment to that violence comes about. What does it matter if you smell the rose and love the smell? I look at the rose and love the color. What does it matter? It doesn't. Any scripture that you read predominantly on some level talks about what matters. And consistently what matters is goodness. Consistently what matters is love. Consistently what matters is a sense of devotion. Consistently what matters is awareness, awakening, and unity. In the Certitudes, a beautiful, beautiful scripture, it says, if you are not inquiring about unity, then you are not asking the question that needs to be asked. Shiva and Shakti are unity. They are forever intertwined because this cosmic logic cannot exist and express itself without the divine dance, the divine creativity and the diversity. So they are forever intertwined, united, and so are we. So much more can be said, and this is just a little tiny bit of a conversation. I suppose that the takeaway today could be an invitation to take more time to pay attention on purpose to the areas in your life where you feel disharmony. And when you experience that disharmony, when you feel that presence, notice if it's bringing suffering. And when you recognize the suffering, ask yourself why you're so attached to it. How you might use your spiritual practices, your religious practices to support you in letting go of it in favor of something else. in favor of a greater healing, in favor of a greater knowing, in favor of a greater consciousness within yourself. Maybe the suffering is part of that. It's definitely the doorway on some moments, but it also closes the door in others. And ask yourself where that suffering is actually coming from. Maybe in that moment of suffering, there is a sense of separation, a sense of I'm alone in this. And if that's what you stumble upon, then maybe try on for size the idea that if you seek unity, if you seek peace, if you seek understanding within yourself, then maybe the suffering will be diminished. At least a little bit. You try it. I can only say that every time that I feel suffering is coming on, and I remind myself of oneness, and I remind myself of unity, and I remind myself of my practices, and I remind myself of these things on purpose, that the suffering doesn't really have a place to be in that moment. So it resolves itself. It surrenders itself into something else. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions or impressions? Yeah? Cal?
Years ago, I heard that the 12 inches from your mind to your heart is the longest foot there is. In my brain, in my mind, I do believe, to the best of my knowledge, that everything is sacred. People, the trees, animals, the planet, everything. But for me, it's very easily forgotten. How do you get it down in where it really penetrates, where it really sticks, where it really,
Yeah. So let's just say that you're 50.
I'm money out of 50.
Wow, happy birthday. Okay. So let's just say that you're 50. And you've been alive on this planet now for 50 years. And over those 50 years, you've told yourself so many stories. Stories of victory, stories of defeat, stories that were useful to you and stories that were not. Science tells us that we spend about 70% of our waking hours telling ourselves stories of worry that will never even happen. But you have been telling yourself stories. And some of those stories you've attached yourself to. And you've put them into a repeating pattern. And in yoga they say you've started to wear a groove into a record, playing the same song over and over and over again. And even if at one point in your life you knew that song or story to be incomplete, you've somehow over time talked yourself into believing it to be some kind of a truth. And that belief is here in the mind. So for as many times as you've told yourself that story, which by the age of 50 years could potentially be hundreds of thousands of times, maybe millions of times. That's how deep that groove is. That's how deep the subtle essences of that story have become in your experience. It's not the entirety of the story, it's the little tiny parts of it that just kind of get stuck in our connective tissue, in the cells of our being. One little word phrases that bring that whole story back to us without our even knowing about it. That's powerful. That is so powerful. It's so powerful that it has on many levels caused us to forget our own empowerment, forget our own goodness, forget our own potential for the sake of a story that tells us that we lack something. So do you think that just one day of coming to yoga class and having a 60-minute experience of struggling to breathe, struggling to balance, struggling to be strong, struggling to see more clearly, and being able to, on some level, even in that very first yoga class that a person goes to, is that enough to overwrite the groove that has been written through literally hundreds of thousands of repetitions of the same story? No. And that's why that foot is the longest foot, because you've got to continue to change your story. And whenever you feel that the old story is creeping in, actively and on purpose remind yourself, that's not the story that I want to know. That's not my choice. I'm making an alternate choice in this moment. I am choosing something else. And some people say, well, isn't that like faking it till you make it? And I said, no, actually, it's really not. It's a war. Yeah. It's a war between who you believe yourself to be and who you know yourself to be. Those are not typically the same thing. Who you believe. I had a professor when I was in graduate school. She's a scientist. And I used the word believe in front of her one time. That was a mistake, by the way. She was a physical scientist, so everything was factual. And she said, Sudha, we don't use the word believe. We know things or we don't know them. Belief is for fairy tales. So it's a battle, it's a war between who you believe yourself to be and the fantasy that you have, all of us, have written for ourselves over all the years that we've been alive, versus who we know ourselves to be in our heart. But that voice of belief, like the believing in the fairy tale, becomes so loud that you can't really, not can't, but a person typically won't hear the whisper of truth that comes from the heart because they're too busy listening to the screaming. They're too busy listening to the story over and over and over again. So at some point, a window of opportunity opens, and in that moment, you have the opportunity to start a new groove, to begin to say to yourself, well, if I'm not happy with that story, then what story should I tell myself? What about the opposite story? Instead of I lack, I'm not good enough, I'm just my suffering, how about I don't really lack? I'm walking a path that is diverse, lots of different experiences, each one having profound meaning for me if I choose it. If I choose it. It is my choice. It is my choice. And I don't have to fake it till I make it. I can just be it. I can just walk that path and stop believing in fairy tales. It's not easy because it's a war and there's so many casualties along the way. But those casualties are all aspects of the ego, the unbalanced ego. And that's the other thing too. Sometimes when we talk about yoga, we talk a lot about the ego, and people get a little about that. They get a little upset about that. They're like, well, what about the ego? There's two aspects of the ego. There's the balanced and the unbalanced. And when the ego is balanced, it's a great thing because it's what keeps you alive and kicking. It's what makes you wish to be awakened. It's what causes you to want to live. The ego is actually, on some level, what's driving you to want to change the things in your life that you see should be changed. When the ego is not healthy, not balanced, that's what keeps us stuck in that groove. Because it's attached to the story, because there's some kind of power there that it's feeding off of. The story is getting attention, or it's just kind of an easier place to dwell because it's what we know.
It's familiar.
It's familiar. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So you just have to keep telling yourself. Just got to keep saying it. In different ways, too. In different ways. I find when I work with individuals that one of the most powerful things that I can say to somebody is, all you're doing is giving yourself a choice. That's all. You're giving yourself a choice in situations where you might not otherwise think you have one. And then you're looking at your choices. And if you go with the one choice, you're acknowledging and accepting you're going to have an experience. And if you go with the other choice, same thing. You're going to have an experience. So be with the experience, no matter what that experience is. And from within the experience, learn about yourself. Learn about what you have beliefs in. Learn about what you have faith in. Belief and faith is not the same thing. Learn about what you know and what you think you know. Learn about where you cut yourself short and where you spread yourself too thin. Learn about where you're fearful and where you're fearless. Ayurveda is very big on qualities. Qualities. Nature is qualities. It's gunas. It's passion. It's lethargy. It's some form of balance. Experience your life by educating yourself, at least initially, on the qualities that you carry. And when you see that there's a quality out of balance, just bring the quality back to balance. When you see you're being too hard, soften. When you see that you're being too soft, be a little bit more disciplined. When you see that you're being hateful, be loving. When you see that you're being loving, don't change. Be loving. Come back to that, Be an explorer. Be a scientist, spiritual scientist. Yeah. It's a great question. And we're all right there, every one of us. Any other thoughts, comments, ideas? Yes?
So you're saying it's possible to be a spiritual scientist?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
And how do you run controlled experiments?
And what was that?
And how do you run controlled experiments?
Well, I guess the one constant would be your faith. Right? That would be the constant. Let me try this in light of that. Let me try this in light of my faith. Let me try this on in light of my faith. So if I adhere to the idea or the essence that there is this potency called Shiva and this potency called Shakti, let me try on everything in light of that and see where it brings me to. It's a different kind of a control than what you have in a laboratory, for sure. And let me see also where my life goes when I don't have faith. Let me just see. Let me watch when you take that one part away and dismiss it. And let me watch and see where I go. Let me pay attention in my own life. And let maybe even my awareness be one of the controls. Presence of awareness, absence of awareness. When do you suffer more? When is the suffering excruciating versus, I don't know what the word is. I can never find the right word for it. But suffering is either excruciating because it puts us into the throes of doubt and loss of connection, or suffering is something else. Suffering is fertile. Maybe that's the word for it, fertile. And suffering is fertile, but not excruciating. It's got its own potency to it. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. It's not like being a laboratory scientist, but it is being an explorer. And explorers are scientists too in their own right. Because they're fearless to go where others have not gone before. Kind of like the Star Trek opening, Yeah. And I like to think also, or recall, I guess, not... all the early spiritualists in India were scientists in their own right. Some people say 2,000 years, some people say 3, some people say... If you talk to a Hindu, they'll say 10,000 years ago. If you talk to a scholar, they'll say 1,500 to 3,000 or thereabouts. You pick a time. A long time ago. A lot longer than the West. They understood atomics. They understood cells. They understood prana. They understood the functioning of the human body. These people who were spiritualists, who were engaged in these esoteric practices and systems of faith building, and they had an understanding of things that we only recently came into knowing. So I don't know. They were scientists, cosmic scientists. And I think that maybe on some level we can look and say, yes, the 7-step scientific method has a purpose to it, but that method can also be limiting because it doesn't have any room for faith. And it doesn't have any space for what we call knowing. And believe it or not, in medicine right now, doctors are now recently coming into understanding that there is a power to knowing in a patient. They're starting to incorporate in hospitals more and more Reiki and yoga therapy and all these other things. Things that doctors and nurses initially, unless they had some exposure to it, would kind of, shun as some sort of voodoo. Like, I don't know what those people do, but, they breathe with the patients. But then they found out that there was a little something missing in the medical community that they're now instructing a lot of nurses and doctors in, and that is the art of listening, the art of presence, the art of breathing, and the art of being with a patient who already knows. And in hospice, they're embracing this also, that there is a level of the person that already knows, and that needs to be given space. That needs to be listened to, rather than pushed aside for the sake of policy or practice or method. I guess it's all in the way you look at it, the way you define what a scientist actually is. Other thoughts? What thoughts do you have?
So I was thinking a little bit about the forgetting piece, and I've been recently reading some work of a sage named Shimaraja, he wrote a text called the Recognition Sutras, and in that text they talk about the 5 acts of the divine. 5 acts being creation, stasis, reabsorption, forgetting, remembering, or ultimately grace. And so the forgetting piece is ultimately written into the instructions of the sort of the pattern of nature, so that the divine can actually then experience itself as you through the element of diversity, right? So those patterns of the 5 acts are constantly occurring at all times within the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that's what allows for the sense of diversity, and that will allows for the opportunity of grace or remembering, so that component of forgetting holds just as much of divinity as the remembering piece.
Absolutely. And there are teachers, old and new, who also say that aspect of forgetting originates in the ultimate consciousness, because upon the moment of becoming on some level what we would call self-aware, it hadn't known itself before. And so in that, which some also recognize as the spanda, the initial pulsation of the universe that brought forth all of this material, the planets, the stars, the sun, this planet, us, that in that spanda, that the diversity was the way that that came to know itself is the way that that comes to know itself, through everything everywhere. Through your acts, my acts, the way that tree grows and dies, the way the earth revolves, the way stars explode, that everything is how that comes to know itself. And that is definitely one of the major tenets of some of the non-dual schools, which is beautiful when you think about it. I like to say to students, there's no such thing as failure and success, unless you're in the West and talking about corporatism. But truly in spirituality, there is no success and there is no failure. There's only experience. Are you aware of your experience? Are you aware that you're stumbling down or standing up? Are you aware of it? And are you accepting self-responsibility? Responsibility is not a word that is like a four-letter word. A lot of times when you talk about responsibility, people's hair goes up on the back of their neck. The word responsibility means that you are able to respond rather than react. That's all it means. Your responsibility. You are able to respond rather than react. So are you aware that you're having an experience? Are you aware that you are falling down or standing up? Are you aware of what you are contributing to your own suffering or the suffering of others? Are you self-responsible? And if you're not, are you willing to become so? And if you're not, well, that's your path. And if you are, that's your path. I never remember which scripture this comes from, although Krishna says it in the Bhagavad Gita to some extent as well. Whatever path you walk, all paths eventually come to me. Now he's talking about, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga. He's talking about the different yoga paths. But ultimately staying that every life, no matter how that life is lived, will eventually and ultimately end up back at source again. Because there's nothing other than that. Neil deGrasse, is that his name? Neil deGrasse, he's the scientist guy he's got a TV show. Yeah, pretty sure that's his name. He was having a conversation with someone. It was either Neil deGrasse or it was Deepak Chopra, one of them. He was having a conversation. They were talking about death. And the gentleman he was talking to was saying how, he's holding on to this life with all his might, that he's not letting go, that, when the end is coming near, he doesn't care, hook him up to every possible tube, give him every possible medicine. He's just terrified of this concept of dying. And it must have been Deepak Chopra, turned around to him and said, I don't understand why you're so afraid of going back to the place that you came to. When you came here, did you have a negative memory of it? When you came here, was the space that you came from so horrible that it would leave upon you an impression that you wouldn't want to return there? No. You came here and you had no inkling of what that was. One could say, so I think that we are at 11:14. I have 1 minute left. Any other thoughts or questions? Everybody's good? All right, let's sit up nice and tall and close the eyes. Just coming back to the Shiva and the Shakti. In the Vigyan by Ravi Tantra, Shiva and Shakti are having a conversation. So perhaps visualize in your mind a man and a woman, a god and a goddess speaking to each other. Shakti says to Shiva, "O Shiva, what is your reality? What is this amazing, numinous universe we see? What do you see when you close your eyes? Who lies at the center of everything? What lies beyond form, pervading all forms, beyond space and time, names and descriptions? Support me in understanding what you see." Let us move forward, supporting each other in having a complete experience of this life, of ourselves, being kind to each other, being patient with each other, being open to a more diverse experience of ourselves and each other. And drawing the hands together in front of the heart. And together we'll lift our voices in one beautiful Om. Take a nice breath in. And bowing the head to the heart, honoring your chosen form, be that Shiva, Shakti, or otherwise. And then drawing the face back to center and releasing the hands. Thank you all so much for being here today. So good to see each and every one of you. We will be leading a weekend retreat, which will focus on Shiva and Shakti. We'll be diving a little bit into some of their conversation. We'll be exploring the meditations. Shiva provides a list of 112 practices that are thought that will bring an individual to Mahachit, or the great consciousness. And so we'll be exploring a little bit about those 112 processes as well. And we'll be doing yagna and having kirtan, which is sacred chanting. So if you're interested to learn more, there's some information on the schedule about that weekend retreat. So wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Lots of other things happening, too. Cafe is serving. Family yoga's in here next. There's reflexology down the hall. There's some vendors down there, too. Please stop by and show them a little love. And just enjoy your day with us. Thank you so much.